Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the study of Antiquity and the Middle Ages. As always, I am your host, Nick Barksdale, and today we are joined once again by Dr. Rebecca Futo Kennedy, who's going to take us through a thought-provoking episode on the term Sub Saharan and the whitewashing of ancient North Africa.
Yeah, so I just think we should sort of because this idea, this sort of continually trying to find this idea of, separating out North Africa from Sub-Saharan as if the Sahara was the impermeable boundary that nobody could get through is really a continually problematic type of argument. Particularly since we have early texts that tell us that, right, Herodotus tells us that, he says the Ethiopians and the Garamantes are indigenous to North Africa, and that, of course, the Phoenicians and the Greeks are not. But he makes it very clear that people he called Ethiopians are indigenous to North Africa, and Northwest Africa in particular, right? But they are not Sub-Saharan. So I constantly, what is the obsession that people have with this idea of Sub-Saharan, that whenever they ask any question, what they're trying to do is prove that Sub-Saharan Africans aren't part of the ancient Mediterranean world, which we know is false. Not only do we know, of course, that people that we would call quote-unquote Sub-Saharan Africans ruled Egypt before the Persians got there, among others, but that they have this continual culture that runs up and down the Nile. And we know from our ancient sources that they believed very firmly, and they interacted with what in the area that they called Libya, right? So ancient geography, Herodotus separates. There's a big geographic debate in the 5th century, right? So on the one hand, we have Hecataeus, who has his map of the world, and Herodotus seems to be addressing him and trying to correct him at various points in his history. But there's debate of whether there's one continent or two continents, whether everything west of the Nile is its own continent called Libya, or whether it's not. One of our ancient sources actually has Europe and North Africa as one continent. Yeah, because Libya is the name that he uses for everything west of Africa, essentially, is what Herodotus uses. But it's also used at some points for the entire continent of what we call Africa. Because remember, Africa is a Roman word. It's not a Greek word. They didn't call it Africa. But yeah, this idea that there's a natural impermeable boundary that starts at the Sahara Desert, and that there's no penetration, and that everybody who has quote-unquote black skin is below that line historically, and everyone above that is somehow magically white, shows, one, a real lack of knowledge of how space works and how geography functions and how mobility and movement in the ancient world functioned. It shows a very limited view of our ancient sources. Like I said, I think I said this in another clip, if you're going to live by Herodotus, you got to die by Herodotus too. And if you're going to cite Herodotus for evidence of one thing, then you have to accept the fact that Herodotus says that the black people, Ethiopians in our ancient parlance, Ethiopians really in our ancient parlance, are indigenous to North Africa. They're indigenous to Libya, which is his word for basically everything north of the Sahara, because as far as he's concerned, south of the Sahara is uninhabitable. Right? They believe that was an uninhabited region, uninhabited zone. Nobody lived there. It was too hot. So this is you have to understand that our ancient sources were very clear that in that northern part of Africa, that's where Ethiopians lived, were indigenous to. That means there were black people there. But also the people that we refer to now as either Nubians or Cushites, those were also called Ethiopians by our Greek sources. And they were in Egypt, and they controlled Egypt for various times. And we actually have a lot of evidence, if you put Egypt into its African context in Antiquity, its vision is not to the north, right? It looks to the Nile and to what we would call south, right? To the upper Nile, the upper Egypt. And in fact, the cult of Isis is actually integrated across the what we would consider the two separate kingdoms of Egypt and Nubia in Antiquity, but their worship of Isis is almost identical, and they are integrated and looking to each other as early as the second millennium BCE. So we really just need to not think about this separation, which isn't even a modern separation, right? This idea of sub-Saharan is a modern racist trope, that there is a magic dividing line, and it is a modern racist trope that develops back from, I'm thinking I should do an Ngram, Google Ngram, just to see when the term sub-Saharan first pops up in books, right? Because one of the things you can always tell is when things start to get hot and when they're not. But if you look at someone like Cuvier, who was one of the early scientists dealing with race back at sort of the turn of the 18th to 19th century, so 1801, 1802 or so. He's the guy who got Sarah Bartman's body after she died, the Hottentot Venus, and had it stuffed and had her genitals and things preserved for study. He makes clear comments about how taking the heads of mummies, which they were sort of just getting at this time out of Egypt, and her dead body and her face, and putting them together. And so here's this like 6,000 or 4,000 year old mummified head, which clearly is not in its original form, right? With her body, a model made of her, and says, look, it's very clear from looking at these two that regardless of whatever their skin color was, they're clearly different races. Because their heads are different, because he was a craniometry guy. So if you sort of think about when is this obsession with sub-Saharan kicking in, it's kicking in when we're trying to, in a period of time where we're trying to separate off Egyptian, these ancient kingdoms that are being discovered by modern Europeans, and the sort of Black South. And actually, I'm looking at a Google Ngram right here that goes back to 1800 up to 2008. I'm going to smooth it out here a little bit more. And the term doesn't start to appear in books anyway, in the English language, until roughly 1978. So, why? Why does this term emerge? It has like very little life before that, and then all of a sudden in the 1960s and 1970s, I see here's an appearance of it in on communism in the Soviet Union. In sub-Saharan Africa is one of the earliest ones that I'm finding and marketing. So that divide seems to be one that has to do with economic policies and what they're viewing as economies in the modern state. It's all about development. So I think when people ask about this stuff, what they're really trying to ask, and they don't want to ask the question, so they use this phrase sub-Saharan, is, are Egyptians white like us? And they don't want to say that, because if they say things like that, then, because what happens when you sort of subsume whiteness for the entirety of North Africa, right? You want to claim the ancient civilization without modern Islam being attached to it. And then you want to separate it from blackness. That's the only reason why people use this term. There's no genetic distinction to be made here. There is no political distinction to be made here in antiquity, or in even clearly up until the modern world. If people aren't using the word, they're not making a distinction about it until they want to use it. All of Africa was a colonial playground until a certain period, and then we're going to make a distinction between the oil-rich Arab states and the mineral-rich and other resource-rich, exploitable states below the Sahara that are not oil-rich states, right? Agricultural versus other. So I think anybody asking the questions about sub-Saharan and how these ideas apply to the ancient world need to stop, because they are clearly, absolutely modern impositions of ideas and ideology, and very clearly they are very recent modern impositions. And whenever people say that they want to avoid imposing modern ideologies onto ancient world, they're okay with imposing modern ideologies onto the ancient world as long as it's their modern ideologies, like the category of sub-Saharan. So I think we need to nix that one. What you're really asking is, are they black or are they white? And the answer is neither, and both, but really neither. There's no white people running around in ancient Egypt. It's just not a category that they used. They did recognize that people had blackness, black skins, and they recognized dark skin tones, but the idea of the white is a gender category, or a category used for people who are cold burned in the very far north, or it is a category that is used for people with certain diseases. Or we actually see it in a poem by Catullus referring to Caesar for a political party affiliation. The blacks versus the whites as a sort of political thing, and then we'll see it. The other place where it might be connected to these sort of politics is that it's also can be connected to chariot racing. Your team, your favorite team. The Greens, the Reds, these are teams. The whitewashing of North Africa also ties in, if you think about this thing, the idea of whitewashing North Africa, some of the loudest voices on the internet in wanting to ensure this dividing line between Sub-Saharan Africa and North Africa are people of Arab descent. I'm thinking here specifically of like Nicholas Talib, right? Because particularly in the United States, since 1910 or so, right, the people who are called Syrian get to be white. Right. So they're categorized, technically, people from the Middle East are categorized as white because of this 1910 or 1919 law that categorized them as white. But they don't get to live the experience of being white in America because they're Muslim. So, but I think there's this bind into people who have recent access to whiteness, particularly in the United States, but also in the Middle East, where there is anti-blackness, severe anti-blackness, that they want to make sure that they can make that harsh dividing line, right? And they are some of the loudest voices. And so whitewashing of the Middle East is an ongoing long-term historical process. But in terms of how Europeans and Americans are doing it, Europeans are doing it primarily as a way to lay claim to the antiquities of Egypt and Libya, which of course is colonized by the Romans. And so you find Roman sites all over Libya and other places. But then in the United States, it has to do with the fact that people who at the time were classified as Syrian, but what we really mean is people of Middle East descent, or people of Arab descent from the Middle East, they got classified legally as white. And so think about what that looks like as someone like me, who is a white person, right, a European descent white person, saying to someone who is like Talib or something that North Africa isn't white, right? Or even more important is that this is actually what happened during the Mary Beard Talib debate, which was Beard was like, they weren't white, Libya and these places are not white spaces. This is not a concept that exists in the ancient world. And Talib comes after her and says, who are you, colonizer, to kick me out of whiteness? Right? But it's all this obsession of wanting to participate in this dominant identity group that is called whiteness, which has no roots in antiquity and has no roots even really in much modernity outside of, it's really a creature of the US, though it appears in European texts earlier. We're the people who sort of run with it and turn it into this idea. And what we actually mean by white is dominant. We don't mean anything to do with our actual skin color.